The land was quiet when the wagons rolled in. Roy sat at the front of the lead wagon, reins loose in his hands, eyes moving slowly across the old outpost as it came into view through the tree line. It was not much to look at. The outer walls were cracked and leaning in places, thick with climbing vines that had spent years pulling at the old stone. The iron gate at the front had rusted into a permanent half-open position, as if it had given up trying to keep people out long ago. Weeds had pushed up through every gap in the courtyard stones, and the 2 wooden watchtowers on either side of the entrance had rotted down to stumps. Roy looked at it for a long moment. Then he climbed down from the wagon. Behind him, the rest of his group began to do the same. There were 11 of them in total. Men and women who had each left something behind to be here. A failed farm. A burned village. A life that had simply stopped working. Roy had not promised them comfort. He had promised them land and walls and a place to start over. The outpost was all 3, even if it did not look like it yet. Lena dropped down from the second wagon and stood beside him, arms folded, studying the gate. She was sharp-eyed and steady, the kind of person who noticed things others walked past. She had been the one to find the sale listing in the first place, buried in a stack of old land records at a border town market. The outpost had been listed as abandoned for over 100 years. No previous buyer. No listed reason for desertion. Just a location, a price low enough to seem like a mistake, and a single line at the bottom that read, "Sold as is." Roy had signed the paper the same day. They spent the first week doing the kind of work that left no time for thought. Clearing the courtyard. Pulling vines from the walls. Patching the gate with salvaged wood and iron strips. The old main building was structurally sound beneath all the decay, and once they swept it out and replaced the broken shutters, it became a livable space quickly enough. Roy worked alongside everyone else from first light to last, hauling stone and cutting timber and saying little beyond what was needed. On the 8th day they found the staircase. It was in the far corner of the main building, behind a collapsed shelf unit that had fallen across a section of floor. When Roy and a broad-shouldered man named Dale moved the shelf aside, they found a stone staircase leading straight down into the dark. The steps were clean. Not dusty, not broken, just old and cold and going somewhere below the foundation of the building. Roy lit a lantern and went first. The staircase went down further than it had any reason to. The air grew colder with each step, and the stone around them changed as they descended, shifting from rough frontier construction to something older and more deliberate, fitted stone with clean edges and walls that curved slightly inward. Whatever this lower level was, it had not been built by the same hands that built the outpost above. At the bottom of the stairs they found a corridor, and at the end of the corridor they found the door. It was enormous. Roy held the lantern up and the light barely reached the top of it. The door was built from stone and dark iron banded together, set directly into the rock of the corridor wall as if it had grown there. It was covered in markings, not painted on but carved deep into the surface, running from the floor all the way up in long columns that curved around the frame. Roy did not recognize the language. He did not think anyone in his group would. There was no handle. No lock that he could see. Just the markings and a thin seam of darkness around the edge where the door met the frame, and a cold that came from the other side that had nothing to do with the underground air. He brought the others down. Lena studied the markings for a long time without speaking. Dale pressed his hand flat against the surface and said it felt like pressing against something alive, though he could not explain why. Roy told them not to touch anything else, and then he spent the next hour looking for a way to open it without using force. He did not find one. In the end they used iron bars and combined weight, working the door slowly along its frame until the seam cracked and a breath of stale cold air pushed outward into the corridor. The markings along the frame seemed to dim slightly as the door moved, as if something inside them had been quietly waiting and had now stopped. Roy noticed it but said nothing. The door swung open. Roy stepped through first, lantern raised, and stopped. The chamber on the other side was vast. The ceiling went up far beyond what the lantern could show. The floor was flat stone and the walls were bare, and in the center of the chamber, taking up most of the space within it, was a creature. It was enormous. Even lying down, even collapsed against the stone floor with its legs folded beneath it and its long neck stretched out along the ground, it filled the room the way a river fills a valley. Its scales were deep gray, almost black in the lantern light, and they were thick with dust as if the creature had not moved in a very long time. Chains ran across its body, dark iron and heavy, anchored into the floor and walls at multiple points, wrapping its legs and neck in the base of its folded wings. Roy stood very still. Then the creature's eye opened. It was gold. Deeply, completely gold, with a black center that adjusted slowly to the lantern light. It was the eye of something that had seen a great many years come and go, and it looked at Roy with an expression that was not rage and was not fear. It was exhaustion. Roy did not move. He did not call out to the others behind him. He simply stood in the doorway with the lantern in his hand and held the creature's gaze and waited, because something in the way that I looked at him told him very clearly that the wrong move now would matter more than any move he had made before. Roy heard Dale take a sharp breath behind him. He raised one hand without turning around. A slow, flat gesture that meant stop. Everyone behind him went still. The lantern light flickered in the cold air coming from the chamber, and the great golden eye in the dark continued to watch him without blinking. Roy took one step forward. Then another. The chains shifted. A low sound moved through the chamber, not quite a growl, more like the sound of stone grinding against stone deep underground. The drake's neck lifted slightly from the floor, and the chains across it pulled taut, and Roy saw clearly for the first time just how many there were. Iron links as thick as a man's forearm, running from iron rings bolted into the bedrock floor, wrapped around the creature's legs, its neck, the base of each wing where they folded against its body. The drake was not loosely restrained. It had been bound with great care and great intention by someone who understood the creature they were dealing with. Roy stopped walking. He crouched down where he was, putting himself lower than the drake's eye line, and set the lantern on the floor beside him. The golden eye tracked the movement. The low grinding sound faded slowly. Behind him Dale spoke in a low voice. He asked what Roy was doing. Roy said he was sitting down. Dale asked why. Roy said because the creature had been chained in the dark for what looked like a very long time, and the least a person could do was not loom over it. There was a pause behind him. Then he heard the others settle. Roy stayed where he was for a long while. The drake watched him. It did not move again, but it did not look away either. Its breathing was slow and labored, each breath lifting the chains slightly before they settled back. Up close Roy could see the damage that the years had done. The scales near the chain points were worn thin, rubbed raw by centuries of iron against hide. There were older wounds too, long healed but visible as pale lines across the dark gray scales. Whatever had happened to this creature before it was sealed in this chamber, it had not been gentle. Roy stood eventually and walked back to the corridor without rushing. He told the group he needed water and whatever dried meat they had brought below. He told Dale to bring a torch so the chamber would have more light. He told Lena to look at the markings on the vault walls, not the door, the interior walls, and to start writing down anything she could copy. Dale asked if Roy was planning to feed it. Roy said that was exactly what he was planning. He came back into the chamber with a full water skin and a cloth bundle of dried meat and set them both on the floor in front of him before crouching again at the same distance as before. The drake had not moved while he was gone. It watched him return with the same exhausted, measuring look as before. Roy opened the water skin and poured some out onto the stone floor, pushing it forward. Then he laid a strip of dried meat beside it and sat back. The drake did not move toward it. Roy had not expected it to. He simply stayed where he was and waited. After a long time the drake's nose lowered an inch. Then another. The chains across its neck pulled tight with the movement and Roy heard the quiet strain of iron under tension. The drake stopped. Looked at Roy. Roy did not move. The drake lowered its nose the rest of the way to the stone and breathed in the scent of the water and the meat from where it was. Then it let out a long slow breath and closed its eye. Roy stayed until the lantern began to burn low. Then he got up quietly and walked out. Behind him in the corridor Lena was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a piece of chalk and several sheets of paper, working her way along the interior wall of the chamber entrance. She had been copying the markings section by section, her handwriting small and careful. She did not look up when Roy came to stand behind her. She said the markings were old. Older than the outpost above by a long measure. The style of the carving matched records she had read once in a border library, records from a period before the current kingdoms existed, when the frontier lands had been governed by a loose collection of warlords and guardian orders. Roy asked what they said. Lena said she did not know yet. She said the language was not one she spoke but that she recognized enough of the structure to work through it given time. She said what she could tell him right now was that the markings were not warnings. Roy looked at the wall. Lena set her chalk down and looked up at him. She said warnings were written to keep people out and these were written to keep something in, but not in the way a prison is built to hold a criminal. She said the difference was in the way certain symbols were repeated and grouped. In the old Guardian script, she said, a prison used symbols that meant contain and prevent. These used symbols that meant hold and keep safe. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he asked who had put it there. Lena picked her chalk back up and turned to the next section of wall. She said that was what she was trying to find out. She said whoever had done it had gone to extraordinary lengths, and that the chains and the ceiling and the markings had all been done by people who cared very much about what happened to the creature inside. She said the part that troubled her was that those people were clearly gone, and no one had ever come back. The Drake did not trust them on the second day or the third. It watched every person who entered the chamber with the same careful golden eye, tracking movement, measuring distance, testing intent. When someone moved too quickly, it would pull against the chains and the grinding sound would fill the room until they slowed down. When someone came too close, it would lower its head and show teeth, not snapping, not lunging, just reminding them that it was still there and still capable. Roy respected that. He came down every morning before anyone else was awake and sat in the same spot on the floor with water and food and the lantern burning low beside him. He did not push closer each day. He did not try to touch the creature or speak too much. He simply came and sat and let the Drake decide what the visit meant. Some mornings the Drake ignored him completely, its golden eye fixed on the ceiling or closed entirely. Some mornings it watched him the whole time without moving. Roy treated both the same way. He sat, he left the food, he went back upstairs. On the fourth day the Drake ate in front of him. It was a slow and deliberate thing. The Drake lowered its head to the cloth Roy had laid on the floor, breathed in the scent of the dried meat for a long moment, then took it. The chains across its neck shifted with the movement and Roy heard the familiar tension in the iron, but the Drake did not stop this time. It ate quietly with its golden eye on Roy throughout, as if waiting for him to react badly to the sight of it. Roy sat with his hands in his lap and watched and said nothing. After that things moved in small steps. Lena began coming down in the afternoons, sitting near Roy and reading aloud from her notes in a calm and even voice, not to the Drake directly but simply letting the sound of a human voice fill the chamber without demand behind it. A young woman in the group named Meg started bringing warm broth in a clay bowl and setting it closer each day than the day before. Dale, who was the quietest of the group when he chose to be, began coming down in the evenings and simply working on small repair tasks near the chamber entrance, the sound of his tools steady and ordinary, giving the Drake something predictable to listen to. By the end of the first week the Drake was letting Meg come within a few feet of it. By the end of the second week Roy was able to sit close enough to see the full detail of the wounds around the chain points. He brought clean cloth and a bowl of water with herbs that Lena said were good for old injuries, and he began carefully cleaning the worn patches of hide where the iron had worked against the scales for so long. The Drake went completely rigid the first time he touched it, every muscle pulling tight, the chains ringing with sudden tension. Roy did not pull back. He kept his hand moving in the same slow careful motion and kept his breathing steady and spoke in a low voice, just simple words, just telling the creature what he was doing and why, not because he was certain it understood every word but because the tone of a calm voice was its own kind of language. The tension in the Drake's body eased. Slowly and not all at once, but it eased. Roy exhaled. He came back the next day and did the same thing. And the day after. The Drake stopped going rigid after the third time. By the end of the second week it had begun to make a low sound when Roy settled beside it, not the grinding warning sound but something quieter and more settled, like a long breath held and then released. Lena finished her translation on the 14th night. She came to find Roy where he was sitting at the courtyard fire and she set her papers down on the log beside him and was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Roy looked at her face and knew before she said a word that what she had found was not simple. She told him everything. The Drake had a name in the old script. A long compound word that translated loosely to something meaning the one who holds the boundary or the warden of open land. It had served as a guardian of the frontier territory for generations, bound not by chains but by an old and willing agreement between the Drake and the people of the land. It had protected the borders, kept the roads safe, driven off the things that came from the deep wilderness. It had been known and honored. Then the war came. A large and brutal force had swept through the region with one specific goal among many. They had heard of the Drake. They wanted it. Not to kill it but to break it and use it, to turn a guardian into a weapon and unleash it against the very people it had once protected. The Guardian Order that served alongside the Drake had seen what was coming and made a decision. They had asked the Drake to accept the chains willingly, to go into the vault and be sealed away until the war ended and it was safe to return. The Drake had agreed. The war ended. The Guardian Order was destroyed in the final battles, every member of it killed in the last push before the enemy broke. The few survivors of the frontier people did not know about the vault or the agreement. The knowledge died with the order. The Drake had waited in the dark for someone to come back and release it. No one came. Roy sat with that for a long time without speaking. Then he got up and took the lantern and went downstairs alone. The Drake was awake when he entered the chamber, its golden eye open and tracking him as he crossed the floor and sat down in his usual spot. Roy set the lantern down and looked at the creature for a moment. The great gray head was resting on the stone, the chains lying still across its body, the worn patches of hide along its neck catching the light. Roy told it the truth in a quiet and level voice. He told it that the people who had put it here were gone. He told it that the war it had been hidden from was over, had been over for a very long time. He told it that no one was coming. Not the Guardian Order, not the old frontier people, not anyone who had known its name or its agreement or its sacrifice. He told it that it belonged to no one now. The chamber was completely silent. Then the drake let out a breath. Not a growl, not a warning sound, just a breath, long and deep and heavy, the kind that carries something with it on the way out. Its great head lowered the rest of the way to the stone floor, settling fully, the tension going out of its neck and shoulders in a slow and visible wave. Roy stayed beside it until the lantern burned low. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. Lena did not sleep much in the days that followed. She went back to the vault walls with fresh eyes and fresh paper, working through sections she had previously set aside as decorative, border carvings that ran along the lower edge of the walls near the floor. She had assumed they were ornamental. She had been wrong. The closer she looked, the more she understood that the border carvings were not decoration at all. They were instructions. She spent 3 days on her knees on the cold stone floor, chalk in hand, copying every symbol in sequence. Her back hurt and her fingers cramped, and she lost track of how many candles she burned through working in the dim chamber light. The drake watched her from across the room during most of it. She had grown used to being watched by it. At some point during the second day, she realized the drake was not watching her with suspicion anymore. It was watching her the way a person watches someone they are hoping will find the right answer. She worked faster after that. On the 4th day she had it. She climbed the stairs and found Roy in the courtyard splitting firewood and told him to put the axe down because she needed him to listen. Roy set the axe against the woodpile and listened. Lena spread her papers on the courtyard table and walked him through it piece by piece. The chains, she explained, were not standard iron. They had been made specifically for this purpose by the Guardian Order, forged with the same old knowledge that had built the vault and carved the markings. They could not be cut or broken by force. Every person who had tried over the centuries, and based on the markings at least a few had tried, had failed completely. Roy asked how they were meant to come off then. Lena pointed to the border carvings section of her notes. She said the Guardian Order had built a release into the chains from the beginning. They had never intended the sealing to be permanent. They had always planned to come back. The release was not mechanical and it was not a key. It was a ritual, and the ritual had one condition at its center that made it unlike anything Lena had read about in any other context. The chains would break only when 2 things happened at exactly the same moment. The drake had to choose to trust, and the human standing before it had to choose the same. Not performed trust. Not forced trust. The real thing in the body in the moment with nothing held back. The Guardian Order had understood something about the nature of the drake that most people never got close enough to learn. A creature like this could not be freed by cleverness or strength. It could only be freed by genuine connection because the chains had been built to respond to exactly that and nothing else. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Lena what the human had to do. Lena said the markings were specific. The human had to approach without weapons. Had to place a bare hand against the drake's chest, over the place where its heartbeat could be felt. Had to hold eye contact and not look away regardless of what the drake did. And had to stay present without fear for as long as it took for the drake to make its own choice. Roy asked how long they usually took. Lena said the markings did not say. She said it probably depended on the drake. Roy nodded slowly. He picked up his axe and put it back in the woodshed. Then he rolled up his sleeves and told Lena to bring the others down in an hour. Lena told him she could do it instead. Roy shook his head. He said it should be him. He did not explain further and Lena did not push. She understood well enough. The drake knew Roy. Whatever fragile and wordless agreement existed between them had been built over weeks of early mornings and quiet presence and steady hands on worn scales. If anyone had a chance of standing in front of that creature without fear in their chest, it was Roy. She told him to be careful. Roy said he would do his best. He went down alone first. The chamber was quiet when he entered. The drake was awake, lying in its usual position, head low, chains still across its body. The golden eye opened when Roy came in and followed him across the floor. Roy walked to his usual spot and then kept walking, moving closer than he had ever gone before, stopping only when he was standing directly in front of the drake's great lowered head. The chains shifted. The low sound began to build. Roy stood still and let it build and did not step back. The sound faded. Roy crouched down to eye level and looked into the golden eye from close range for the first time. Up close it was extraordinary, deep and layered and very old, the black center wide in the low light. Roy looked into it and the Drake looked back at him and neither of them moved. Then Roy reached up and began to remove his jacket. He folded it and set it on the floor. He rolled back his sleeve and extended his right hand, open, palm forward, moving it slowly toward the Drake's chest. The Drake pulled back an inch. The chains rang. Roy kept his hand moving. Slow and steady and open. The Drake went still. Roy pressed his bare palm flat against the scaled chest in front of him and felt the heartbeat immediately. It was slow and enormous and deep, like a drum being struck far underground. Roy kept his hand there and kept his eyes on the golden eye in front of him and breathed and waited. The chamber was completely silent. Then something shifted in the golden eye. Something that had been held tight for a very long time began to loosen. The Drake's breathing changed, slowing further, deepening. The great body in front of Roy grew still in a way it had never been still before, not the stillness of wariness but the stillness of a decision being made. Roy did not move, did not blink, did not breathe loudly. He just stayed. The first chain snapped at the floor anchor. The sound was sharp and clean like a branch breaking in winter air. Then a second. Then 3 more in quick succession, the sound filling the chamber and bouncing off the stone walls, iron links hitting the floor and ringing out and going quiet. Then all of them at once. The sound was enormous. Lena and the others in the corridor outside flinched back from it. Dust came down from the ceiling and the lanterns swung on their hooks and the floor seemed to vibrate for a moment under the weight of it. Then silence. Roy stood where he was with his hand still pressed against the Drake's chest and watched. The Drake rose. It was slow at first, unsteady, limbs that had not carried full weight in centuries finding their footing with care. The wings unfolded slightly for balance and the neck came up and the head rose above Roy and kept rising until the Drake stood at its full height, filling the chamber in a way that made the stone walls seem suddenly much closer. It was enormous. Not just large but genuinely enormous, the kind of size that changes the way a room feels simply by being present in it. Roy looked up at it. The Drake looked down at him. Then with a slowness that seemed almost deliberate, almost ceremonial, the great head came back down. All the way down. The enormous scaled chin came to rest on the stone floor directly in front of Roy's feet, the golden eyes level with his knees, the whole massive neck curved low in a bow so complete and so unhurried that every person watching from the corridor doorway went completely silent. Roy looked down at the Drake for a long moment. Then he placed his hand on the top of its great head, gently, the way a person touches something they understand the value of. Neither of them moved for a long time after that. The morning after the chains fell, everything was different. Not loudly different. Not in a way that announced itself or demanded attention. Just different in the quiet way that mornings are different after something important has changed, the air a little clearer, the sounds a little more distinct, the whole world seeming to have shifted slightly on its axis overnight without anyone seeing it happen. Roy was up before dawn as usual. He went downstairs with a lantern and a large bundle of fresh meat that Dale had prepared the evening before. When he stepped into the chamber the Drake was already awake, standing, its great head turning toward the door when Roy entered. Without the chains the movement was completely different. There was no ring of iron, no grinding tension, no sound of restraint pulling against intention. The Drake simply turned and looked at him, free and easy and whole, and the silence where the chain sounds used to be was so complete that Roy stopped walking for a moment just to feel it. He set the meat down and stepped back. The Drake crossed the chamber to it without hesitation. Roy watched it move and understood for the first time just what the chains had truly cost. Even weakened and unsteady on legs that had not carried its full weight in centuries, the Drake moved with something underneath the effort that spoke of what it had once been. A natural authority in every step. A sense of something that belonged exactly where it was. Roy stood quietly to the side and did not interfere and let the creature eat in peace. Afterward the Drake stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the door. Roy walked to it and pushed it open wide. The Drake followed him up the stairs. It took time. The staircase was not built for a creature of that size and the Drake had to move carefully, angling its body and folding its wings tight against itself to fit through the narrower sections. Roy went ahead with the lantern and waited at each landing. The Drake made no sound of complaint. It simply worked through each obstacle with a patience that seemed very old and very practiced, the patience of something that understood the value of enduring small difficulties on the way to something worth reaching. When they came up through the floor of the main building and out into the courtyard the dawn light was just beginning to show above the eastern wall. The settlers who were already up stopped what they were doing. Meg stood frozen near the well with a water bucket in her hands. Dale set down his tools. Lena came out of the side building with her papers under her arm and went completely still in the doorway. The drake stepped into the courtyard and raised its head. It looked at the sky for a long time. The early light caught the gray scales and showed colors in them that were not visible underground, deep greens and faint blues running through the gray like veins of something precious. The wings spread slightly, not fully, just enough to feel the open air against them, and a sound came from the drake that none of them had heard before. Low and resonant and long, somewhere between a breath and a note, rising slightly at the end. Roy thought it sounded like relief. Word traveled faster than Roy had expected. By the end of the first week, a merchant passing through on the old border road had seen the drake moving along the outer wall of the outpost and had carried the story to the nearest town. By the end of the second week, that story had reached 3 more towns and 2 minor lords whose territories bordered the frontier land. By the end of the month, Roy had received 4 separate messages from neighboring powers, each one carefully worded and each one carrying underneath its careful words the same basic question, which was what exactly was living at the old outpost and whose side was it on. Roy showed the messages to Lena. Lena read them all and set them down and said the question of sides was the wrong question. She said what the lords were actually asking was whether they needed to worry. She said Roy should write back and answer that question directly and let them draw their own conclusions. Roy wrote 4 short replies. Each one said the same thing. The outpost was settled and occupied. Its residents were not looking for trouble. Anyone who came looking for trouble would find that the outpost was better defended than it appeared. He did not mention the drake by name. He did not need to. The scouts had already done that work for him. The visits from neighboring lords that had been quietly planned in the weeks before the chains broke were quietly unplanned in the weeks that followed. 2 border warlords who had been moving men toward the frontier road turned those men around. A lord from the Northern Territory who had sent a formal letter claiming ancestral rights to the outpost land sent a second letter 2 weeks later withdrawing the claim without explanation. The frontier around the outpost, which had been restless and watched for years, went still. Lena finished the last section of her translation during this time and came to Roy with the drake's name. She said it was a compound word in the old Guardian script and that there was no perfect match for it in common language. The closest she could get, she said, was something like the one who holds the boundary or the warden of the open land. But those were long and formal and did not feel right for daily use. She said the root of the name, the oldest part of it, the part that the Guardian Order had likely used when speaking to the drake directly, translated simply and cleanly to one word. Ember. Roy said it aloud once, quietly testing the shape of it. From across the courtyard the drake's head turned toward him. Roy looked at it. The great golden eye looked back. He said the name again, a little more clearly this time, and the drake crossed the courtyard to him in 4 long unhurried strides and lowered its head to his level and held still. Roy reached up and rested his hand on the side of the great scaled jaw and felt the warmth that lived beneath the scales, steady and deep and alive. He said the name was a good one. Ember made the low resonant sound that Roy had begun to understand meant something close to agreement. In the weeks that followed, Ember grew stronger in a way that was visible almost day by day. It ate well and slept in the courtyard under the open sky and spent long hours simply standing in the sun with its wings half spread, absorbing warmth that 300 years of underground dark had taken from it. The worn patches of hide around where the chains had been began to heal, new scale growth coming in slow and healthy at the edges. The unsteadiness in its legs disappeared entirely by the 3rd week, replaced by the full and grounded movement that Roy had glimpsed on that first morning. Ember began going beyond the walls. Not far at first. Just to the tree line and back, moving through the land at the edge of the outpost with its nose low, reading the ground the way a person reads a familiar book they have not opened in a long time. Then further, following the old border markers that still stood half buried in the grass and undergrowth, tracing routes that Roy suspected had not been walked in 3 centuries. Sometimes Ember was gone for most of a day. It always came back before dark. Roy never worried when it was gone. He was not entirely sure when that had happened, the point at which he had stopped thinking of Ember's absence as a risk and started thinking of it as simply a thing that happened and resolved itself. It had not been a decision. It had just become true at some point, the way trust usually does, quietly and without announcement. On a still evening near the end of the month, Roy climbed to the top of the old outpost wall to watch the sun go down over the frontier land. The view from up there was long and clear, the tree line dark against the orange sky, the border road a pale line cutting through the grass below. It was the kind of evening that made a place feel like it belonged to you, or perhaps more accurately like you belonged to it. He heard the sound of Ember coming back before he saw it, the steady rhythm of large movement through the grass below the wall. The drake came around the corner of the outer wall and then came up alongside it, moving easily at height, its head rising above the wall top and coming to rest a few feet from where Roy stood. Roy looked at it. Ember looked out at the land. Roy reached over and rested his hand on the scaled neck beside him, feeling the steady warmth and the slow strong pulse beneath. Ember did not move away. Did not turn. Just stood there with its golden eye on the darkening horizon, watching the last of the light leave the sky over the frontier land it had once protected and was now, in its own quiet and unhurried way, beginning to protect again. The outpost was lit behind them. The settlers were inside, fires going, the sound of voices and movement carrying up through the still evening air. Below the wall the land stretched out long and dark and quiet. Roy kept his hand where it was. Ember stayed. And in the growing dark of that frontier evening, in the silence that sat between a man and an ancient creature who had each found in the other something they had not known they were looking for, the old outpost felt for the first time like something more than walls and stone and a place to start over. It felt like home.